Richard Skipper celebrates. Every show is a celebration. Each show, Richard delivers the artists you love, showcasing what makes them unique. Never gossipy. The antidote to a sometimes hectic world. Now, here's your host, Richard Skipper.
Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Richard Skipper Celebrates. For those of you who are here for the first time, my show is about celebrating artists and their body of worth. And there are artists on both sides of the footlights, as you will find tonight. First of all, I'd like to remind everyone, today marks 344 days since our theaters shut down. So my heart goes out to all of the artists, again, on both sides of the footlights, vendors, restaurants, those who sell the merchandise, every person who is part of this community. And the operative word tonight is community, as you're going to hear throughout this interview. And that's what Broadway is all about, community. And I am so excited to be celebrating Tom Viola this evening of Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS. He truly is one of my favorite people on the planet, whether he knows it or not. I always see him at all of the Broadway Cares events. I have been lucky enough over the years to work the Broadway Flea Market. I've done Broadway Bears, the B-E-A-R-S variety. I was there a couple of years ago with the Carol Channing bear that we auctioned off. All of these events are so exciting. This platform that I use actually came about as a result of the pandemic. I'd been thinking of doing a live stream podcast. And last year, just in time for Broadway Backwards, one of my favorite evenings in the theater, one of my favorite people and good friends, Leslie Ann Warren, was supposed to take part. So I reached out to her. I said, "You're coming to New York for Broadway Backwards. Would you mind being my first guest for my podcast?" And she said yes. We said yes, not knowing what was ahead. And just a few days later, everything shut down. Leslie called me just before they'd made the decision to say, "Richard, I don't know if this is the right thing to do or not." None of us knew what was ahead. But one person who has always been steady and steadfast through all of this is Tom Viola. And the work that Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS is still doing is incredible. I don't know of one person who has ever said one bad thing about Tom. Don't take my word for it. I have a few people here who want to say hello, and then we'll meet Tom on the other side of this clip.
Tom Viola, who has been the executive director of Broadway Cares now for I'm not sure how long. He's the second executive director, and I don't know what we'll do if he ever even thinks he's going to retire.
There is no one like Tom Viola. No one.
Oh, Tom Viola. Oh, my heart goes pin-pat. I love Tom Viola. If he was straight, we'd be married right now.
Tom is smart and fearless and knowledgeable and, did I say fearless?
I think Tom, to be quite honest, was the protector of Broadway Bears, because I think in the beginning they got a lot of flack for the show, and they never really said anything to me. They never dampened my spirits.
Tom still is working tirelessly to keep things running in running order, to make sure that the competitions happen, to make sure that we are able to do these wonderful programs, like Stripology, the Easter Bunny competitions, and all the shows that we've done to raise money. They work very, very hard.
You know, his dedication to this company, it's all about his vision and the expansion, you know, from where it started, you know, because I have been around since pretty much the beginning, you know, the first sort of 3 to 4 years that the company was being formed. It was when I moved to New York, and, you know, to watch it expand into this international organization that raises millions and millions and millions of dollars.
He's a good friend. He's a really great friend of everybody in this business. And I just feel personally that he's a good friend to me too.
Yes, it is the house that Tom built. It is Tom's particular, it's a mixture of qualities that you seldom find.
I think he is just the right mix of kindness and leadership. And there's few people like that.
That, of course, is from the brilliant documentary Heart of Broadway. Tom, I am so thrilled,
Hey, Richard,
to joining me this evening. How are you?
Really? I'm good. No, I'm good. That was lovely to see. I haven't thought. Wow. Just some incredibly sweet people there, all of them. And I love Lilius's remark that we would be married. I think that would be a scary thought. But
well, if I was straight, I think you and I would be married too. So
there you go.
No, Tom, you are truly. I don't want to embarrass you or anything, but you truly. I have seen you at so many events over the years. You're always running around doing what you do better than anyone I know. And I want to talk about the road that led to this.
Sure.
Because I don't know a lot about you. And tonight, I want to celebrate you. I want our viewers to get a chance to know who you are. One of the things that I do with my interviews is I always like to go back to the 5-year-old self. That time before you went to school and before the layers of peer pressure and everything were laid up on you. I want to start there. I want to know, first of all, where you're from, a little bit about your parents and your home life.
Yeah. Okay. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My dad is the first generation Italian immigrant. His parents, came over from northern Italy, actually the Alps up there, in 1920, and settled in Morgantown, West Virginia. And I remember my dad actually telling me that he really barely spoke English by the time when he first entered. Can you imagine a public school in the 1930s, early 30s? So that's his background, and he has one sister. My mom comes from south of Pittsburgh, as opposed to sort of this Italian stock. She was a mix of everything, and they met when they were both working in Pittsburgh for AT&T, for the telephone company. My mother was an operator, and my dad was just beginning to move forward in sort of their management position. But I was raised south of Pittsburgh in a place called Bethel Park in the 60s, which is a very sort of suburban 60s suburb. Was raised there, went to Catholic school for 8 years. Have all my stories about being raised by the nuns, when they started off being in those very Sound of Music-like habits. And then by the time I moved to the public school after 8th grade, they were all decked out looking like they worked in an office. But it was a good, upbringing. I have 3 younger sisters. I'm the oldest of 4. So
Same here.
Yeah. So it's, my 5-year-old self, I don't know. I remember sort of, just being at home, sort of figuring it out there. I mean, my first real memory of sort of feeling like who I would become actually was being very young and in first grade. And I had a little pet canary that I adored before I actually went into first grade. He named Petey, who died. As they do, in the bottom of the cage. And I remember going in to St. Thomas More first grade to this nun, Sister Frances, and going up to the front of her desk and saying, "My bird Petey died." And my mom told me, "But that's not to worry because Petey went to heaven." Very nice. And this nun actually looking at me and saying, "Oh, Tom, no. Birds don't have souls. they don't go to heaven. Your bird died. And I was so upset by
No,
this.
I can imagine. I'm upset
horrified.
now.
Yeah, I was so horrified. I mean, I literally went, I remember this distinctly, went back to this desk, put my head in my arms, and just sort of cried for just for the rest of the day. Number one, my bird was dead and wasn't in heaven. And number two, my mother had lied to me. Somehow I even figured that out. And when I went home, I remember saying to my mother, Sister Frances said Petey's not in heaven. And that was the end of it. The next day, I went to school and I sat at my desk, and Sister Frances goes like this. And I go up to the front and she said, Tommy, I'm here to tell you your bird's in heaven. And I went, oh, well, I felt much better, and it perked up and everything seemed fine. But what I found out years later, literally retelling the story to my mother, is she said, oh, that nun. She said, when you came home and told me that, I got on the phone to that convent. My mother had been a Presbyterian who converted to Catholicism to marry my dad. So she didn't carry a lot of the fears of the nuns. And she said, I don't care what you think. You tell that kid his bird's in heaven. And somehow that spirit or that feeling of both loving protection and like, I don't have to put up with this kind of nonsense. I don't know. That's sort of where I came from.
Well, what were your aspirations going through school, and what you wanted to do with your life after graduating from high school?
Oh God. I wasn't great in sports, of course.
Now, why do you say "of course"?
Of course. I mean, I was fine, but not, but it was not really, where I stood out by any means. But I love to read. I love to draw. I took piano lessons. I did a lot of those kind of things. My family, there was a lot of activity around a television set and a lot of activity. I saw that my parents were very involved with the world that they were a part of. And I think that's where I kind of learned that's where I could connect. And certainly, as I got older,
you had an aspiration that you wanted to be a part of the theater world.
I didn't know about the theater. No, I
Okay.
really didn't. I didn't really know much about the theater world. I think the first, when I went to high school, I was in the choir, so they did musicals, so I was in the musicals, and I loved the sense of connection and chosen family, and that gave me. And I also began to sense there was a bigger world than than my neighborhood, than what I was involved in, that I really sort of longed for and wanted to be a part of. And because I read a lot. I read a lot of newspapers. I had a sense of there being places bigger than suburban Pittsburgh, and even bigger than Pittsburgh. I was an adventurous kid, actually. As I got older, I went to art school in Pittsburgh on weekends, and literally would, take the trolley at the time, home from Carnegie Museum as like a 7th, 8th, and 9th grader, and and all the sort of exploration and craziness that can lead you to. So yeah, by the time my family moved north of Pittsburgh right before I was a junior in high school, and by that time I really had a sense that this was not where I was going to hang. This was not where I was going to be. And through just a series of serendipitous occurrences, I ended up sending a tape and auditioning, literally on a reel-to-reel tape, for what was the musical theater department at CCM, College-Conservatory of Music in Cincinnati. And I really sort of did this at the encouragement of this drama teacher I had, who probably herself was about 22 or 23 at the time. I even sent the information to her office at the high school. So when I was accepted, that's where the acceptance came. And I remember going home and saying, well, I did this. And my parents sort of having the wherewithal, and here comes one of my cats, the wherewithal to more or less go, okay. And that was sort of stepping off into my life.
And how did the move to New York happen for you?
Well, like everybody else, at school. And I have friends, from those years that are still very, very close friends. We aspired to be here. It was all about wanting to come to New York. And, we'd have a break, or we'd have spring break, or, between semesters, and literally I would stop in Pittsburgh for like a drive-by, hi, and then take People Express, to LaGuardia and hang in New York with either my friends from school or people that we ended up meeting up here, much rather than just hanging out at home in Pittsburgh.
And when you first came to New York, did you have roommates? Where did you first stay when you came?
When I began coming up here, I got this. It seemed like my place in New York, as I began to discover the city, was the Upper West Side, which was very much not the Upper West Side that it is in New York today. I mean, literally, I remember.
What year are we talking about?
This is, I went to school between 72 and 76. So by the time I got up here in 76, it was, the city was in the,
I arrived in 1979, so I know what you're talking about.
Back on its heels. And, I knew some folks here, and my first apartment was on 71st Street between West End and Broadway, right by the McDonald's there.
Okay.
In a brownstone as you headed up towards West End Avenue. It was the floor through of a brownstone with the garden for, are you ready, $350 a month.
Nice.
And yeah, so
which was a lot of money at that time.
Was.
If you didn't have it, it was a lot of money.
It was, and I jumped into classes at HB down with Austin Pendleton, and studied with Ray Allen and Terry Schreiber, and began to, I'd done summer stock, non-equity summer stock between years at school, and really, began to sort of figure out what my place was up here and exploring the city.
Reading your resume, one of in your bio, one of the things that jumps out at me is, with everything that you've done, you also acknowledge that you were a very good cater waiter.
I was. Well, I was efficient, I guess, and we had fun and we're crazy. But I worked as a waiter in school, and then when I came up here, actually my first job was working as a waiter at a place called the Grand Finale, which was on 70th Street. And that was an education, because that was like throwing, just an innocent to the wolves practically. But I had a great time there. And
were there any other odd jobs that you had when you first came?
I did all sorts of things. I cleaned apartments. I mainly did the restaurant thing. I worked at a restaurant called Dobson's that was on Columbus Avenue at 76th Street. When that opened up, and Columbus was sort of exploding with gentrification, and it felt like our neighborhood in a certain respect. And I have friends literally from those days. Then gradually, I began to get some jobs in the theater. I worked in some dinner theater and regional theater. Did some negligible things here, here in town. The usual under fives on the soaps, and some non-union commercials. And I landed up doing some voiceovers at one point. And then I got a job with a literary agent, and in between where I thought acting jobs. And it was a man named Ron Bernstein, who represented, of all people at that time, Larry Kramer, who had just had a big success with a book called Faggots.
Faggots, yes.
Which was a huge sort of sensation and controversial book.
Yes.
Yeah, this is probably about 1981, maybe. Something like that. So that's when my paths first crossed with Larry. And it was also at the time where I was realizing I wasn't really very happy auditioning. I don't know that I enjoyed auditioning. I loved the rehearsal process. I loved, of course, being in the middle of all of that. But the auditioning, which you have to love, I did not I did not much. And that's when I began to freelance write, and really had a much better quality of break as a freelance writer, even throwing just things over the transom, than I did as an actor. And I think that's because I didn't feel like I was being judged as I walk into a room just by what I sort of looked like, I guess. That it really, so that put me on another path, which truly, in between all these freelance writing gigs that I was doing for American Airlines and a lot of general interest magazines, as you could do then, I ended up at Actors Equity Association as doing some pen for hire jobs for them through a friend. And that was about 1986, 87.
And that led to you.
And that dovetailed into
Colleen Dewhurst.
becoming Colleen's assistant, Colleen Dewhurst's assistant, just about the time that the Equity Fights AIDS Committee was formed.
Wow.
And it was more, and Colleen was so determined that would have some kind of root in the Broadway community at the same time that Broadway Cares was formed, that she really just sort of parted the waters for me in a way, so that all of this energy and sort of non-direction that I had ended up being focused right there. I think I was really, really at that time in my life, I was maybe 33, 34, really looking to connect to something that all these various things that I had done could focus into. And that was it.
I only met her once, and it was when we were in a picket line together when they were going to rip down the Piccadilly Hotel, the Morocco Theater, yes, sure, and save the theaters. And I was there between her and Tony Randall, fighting this kid from South Carolina who knew how important these theaters were. And it took me, I didn't even want to go to the Minskoff when it opened, because I was so angry about these theaters being ripped down. But I mean, would you consider, in addition to working with her, and this may or may not be a silly question, hopefully it's not, but a mentor to you?
Oh, without a doubt.
And what did you really learn from Colleen Dewhurst? Things that you've carried throughout the rest of your life?
I think the most important thing that she taught me completely by example, it wasn't anything that I think she ever told. You don't have to be perfect to make a difference. Mm-hmm. Colleen led very much with her heart, and at the same time had a very smart, capable head, if you will, and was an extraordinary talent. But I could really see that the empathy that she brought to everything she viewed and sort of was a part of, I feel like she kind of gave me permission, in a certain respect, to explore that part of myself, to share that part of myself, to risk actually uncovering that part of myself. Mm-hmm. So yeah, truly, meeting her put my life on a different path. And what I also saw from her too is, I mean, again, this was a woman who was far from perfect or necessarily organized this was a woman who was very, very real, and had a lot of room for people's foibles and mistakes. I mean, I feel like even today, I make decisions around Broadway Cares or around things we do or how we behave that truly come from how she might have responded. Mm-hmm. It's a huge, it turned my life around, truly.
And I want to go right back. As I mentioned, I came to New York in 1979, not realizing my full potential of who I was. And by the time that I came to the realization that I was gay and that, in this community, as I was evolving, we were hearing about the gay cancer and everything. And, I know that most of our listeners and viewers may very well remember that time. Some may not. But if you could take us back with Equity at that point and how long it was before you guys were hearing about this and what the early stages were of all of that.
It wasn't really so much Equity for me. I mean, what it was about is, I mean, literally, I moved here in 76. So I'm 21 years old, 1976, and, frisky and crazy and looking for all sorts, I mean, I as much came here to be an actor and to sort of discover the city as much as I came here to be gay. I knew that this was a place that I could be comfortable, that it wouldn't be something that I had to necessarily hide, that there was, communities within communities where we all kind of spoke the same language. And when you're that young too, you're sort of given a free pass to sort of explore that. And so, and I also, as you did a couple of years later, came to town that was in the midst of an explosion of craziness and sexual freedom, if you will, and the city being so down on its luck at that time that there were, you had access and to practically everything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as you don't necessarily do now. It was a very, it was a place where you could live on a nickel practically. I mean,
absolutely true, absolutely.
And in the middle of town even. So I experienced that, in the first few years that I was here. But literally, I can remember clear as day when I was at a coffee shop on 72nd in Amsterdam called Pier 72 with my boyfriend at the time and a good friend of mine who I knew from Dobson's, where I'd been working as a waiter, and another friend of ours. We were all having breakfast. It was July 3rd, I think it was, 1981. And we used to get the newspapers and share them and read, did breakfast and, carry on. And I remember reading the article in the Times, rare cancer found in 51 homosexuals. And it was a tiny little column like that.
Mm-hmm.
And all of us kind of, what is this? And sort of figuring that it really didn't have much to do with us. So that's like, 81?
Mm-hmm.
By that time I had, friends who were working, my viewpoint had sort of expanded, a little bit. But I still didn't necessarily feel that this was something that I would necessarily have to be concerned with. This was with a generation older than myself and my friends. This was with, again, guys who were more into a scene that we weren't necessarily in, that didn't feel so much about the West Side, but more about the Village.
Mm-hmm.
And guys who partied harder than we did, although we all dabbled and we all, were carrying on. I can distinctly remember, though, when it really became apparent that this was closer to me than I thought. A friend of mine who was a dancer and made, and was working, I hadn't seen for a while, and I was walking up Broadway, and I saw him coming down towards me, walking, like from 79th Street, as I was walking up from, 71st or 72nd. And when I saw him, I could see that he saw me, and he did not look good. He looked tired, worn. And we did that thing where you determine not to acknowledge each other. We walked by each other. And I remember feeling very bad about that and very scared by that this was clearly the first time the idea of someone being sick really entered my consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, it became more and more prevalent as it got closer and closer. But there was still a point where it felt like we were all holding it away from ourselves.
Absolutely.
I remember going to Dobson's, actually, for brunch. And I've told the story a couple times before, but I was at a table with like 8 people. And again, all, sort of people who were sort of just beginning to make their way in the business. A guy named Ray Gill, who was understudying, I think, in Pirates of Penzance. A friend of mine, Scott Oakley, who was a musical director on, I think it was Pal J. People who, and we're all talking about this, about why it wasn't us. It was were people, others, even though, again, we were hardly well behaved.
Mm-hmm.
That was 1984.
Mm-hmm.
10 years later, of those 8 guys, 4 were dead, and 2, including myself, were HIV positive. So that's how much what seemed not to be about us became very, very much us. And certainly by the time I began working at Equity in 87, and the Equity Fights AIDS was founded in 88,
Mm-hmm.
People were practically terror-struck. And also in terms of the ramifications.
I want to go back to that for just a moment, Tom. Excuse me for interrupting,
Sure.
but if you can just take us back to that time when we knew that it was happening around us, but when you first really felt the impact that it was having on the theater community.
Well, again, I really wasn't as involved with the theater community, certainly as, I wasn't, working on our offering. So it didn't necessarily feel about the theater community to me immediately. I mean, talk about where I could really feel it rip was with the guys that I, was part of this crew of cater waiters, that worked for Donald Bruce White and Glorious Food and In Service and the Silver Palette. I mean, to literally sort of see people that, just begin to not look well and then disappear. And all the horror stories of the stigma that was imposed, and and reading the stories about of church and state and families who literally were just pushing people away rather than embracing them, certainly. So by the time I got to equity, and this became something that the union, Equity Fights AIDS, wanted to respond to, I certainly was well aware of what was going on and what needed to be done. So,
and at that time, I mean, Broadway Cares, Equity Fights AIDS were two completely.
We were two separate organizations. Equity Fights AIDS. Of course,
my earliest memory, I remember in 1988 being at the Monster, standing around the piano with Stanley Keeler at the keyboard, at the piano playing. And a group of actors came in late at night with Broadway Cares pens on.
Oh, wow.
And they had, passed a bucket around, explained at that time what those of us in the community needed to do to protect ourselves.
Sure.
And I remember leaving there that night with this fear that it was hitting closer because I, had the same thoughts that you did. I wasn't involved deeply in a lot of the activities that I thought that people were involved in. But something clicked and changed in me that evening when I first heard about Broadway Cares for the first time. So if you can take us back to when the two organizations merged together.
Well, sure. I mean, we merged in 92, but we worked side by side for the 4 years or so leading up to there. I mean, Equity Fights AIDS came out of Actors Equity. Broadway Cares was founded by a group of producers at just about the same time. And, there was a lot of grassroots activity at the union, with Equity Fights AIDS, reaching out, doing a lot, whether it was doing a bake sale at Katz or beginning the cabaret series at Steve McGraw's. There was a lot of grassroots effort, which, over the next couple of years actually raised a surprising amount of money. And I have to say that the leadership at the union, both the counselors, but certainly Colleen and Alan Eisenberg, really allowed there to be room for that. At the same time, Broadway Cares was created, and they began to raise money a little more traditionally. In terms of, what was the beginning of the Easter bonnet competition. And then right about 89, right about the time that the founding members of both organizations, some of these, the board at Broadway Cares and some of the counselors and folks who were really in sort of driving this Equity Fights AIDS piece, each kind of wished the other would go away. And I have to say, because I think each one figured they, wanted to be the one that was doing this within the Broadway community. Well, that's when Broadway Cares brought Roger McFarlane on board as their executive director. He had just left GMHC. I mean, if you don't know this, The Normal Heart, written by Larry Kramer, of course, the character in The Normal Heart of Tommy Boatwright is Roger. That is completely Roger. When he refers to himself as the Southern Bitch Queen, that is exactly what Roger would have said. And Roger broke. He had no patience for folks who didn't get what needed to be done and do what they could do to address that. And when he sensed that these two sort of fledgling organizations in the Broadway community were kind of working together, but not really, he met with me and he said, look, there is so much to do here, and there is so much that we can do here together. You and I are going to move forward together, and people will either join us in this or they'll fall by the wayside. And indeed, that's what we did. We really did begin to work together on events, whether it was the first Gypsy of the Year, working together on the flea market, all sorts of things. So by the time,
excuse me, was it an easy transition once you made that decision to work together?
No, Roger had such an incredible energy that I really was sort of bound, he was extraordinary. So I was looking for someone to sort of lead the way. I mean, I remember Roger saying to me one time, right after, as we were merging, he said, and this will sound odd to repeat, but he remember saying to me, he said, "You build the stage, I will stand on it." And I was okay. I was completely okay with that, because at that time I loved sort of the busyness, the taskness, if that's a word, of making these things happen. And Roger could really speak to people in a way that gave us a gravitas that at that time I certainly did not have. So
well, if there was this, what's the right word I'm looking for? Tension between the two divisions. What were some of the biggest obstacles that you were facing trying to move?
Well, the interesting thing is the tensions were only a little bit, were internal and not things that the people would necessarily have been aware of. Because by the time we proposed merger in '92, we really had to merge because we had completely outgrown doing this from offices at Actors Equity. And frankly, the Equity Fights AIDS piece of this had a more energy to it than necessarily the Broadway Cares piece of it, even though they had the better name. So by the time we proposed merger, I would think most people in the community thought we were one and the same anyway. So it wasn't like anything we had to convince.
I did.
Convince the community of. And we went through all the proper, the proper regulations and permissions and everything we had to do that. But we did know, both Roger and I, that it was not going to be a matter of losing one name or the other. So it truly, that's where this name, this with a slash, Broadway Cares / Equity Fights AIDS, came about, because that's how we could best move forward. And we assumed the missions of both organizations. And then we became...
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, and then we became our own separate 501c3, not-for-profit, in May of '92, and moved to what were separate offices across the hall from the elevator bank on the 16th floor at Actors Equity. So, my office moved about 20 feet. Rogers came over from where he was sharing an office in, I think it was Maria de Dia's management office at the time. And it just seemed to be exactly the way it was supposed to occur. And 1 + 1 really equaled 8.
Now, I read somewhere, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong on this, that you feel that the move forward really began to propel with the Phyllis Newman Women's Health Initiative.
Yes, that was the beginning. That was the first step in what became what I would call our expanded mission, which is why we even are who we are today. Because certainly in the years, leading up to '92 and the merger and then the first couple of years, those were very, very dark. That was dark time. I mean, there was no sense that there was going to be the antiretrovirals, which would turn this all around. Things very much, were still felt and to be, a death sentence, certainly.
And the other thing is, we didn't have social media at that time. And you would find out about people passing on and moving on just from being immersed in the community, of going to a club or an event and saying, I haven't seen so-and-so in a while. And it's very sad.
So by '96, when the retrovirals came about and it began to shift our experience of this, although certainly not mean that it was over even to this day, that was when the Actors Fund created the Phyllis Newman Women's Health Initiative. And I remember a meeting with Phyllis and her wanting to do events like we did, for the Women's Health Initiative. And how do we do that? And can you give me any advice, or what would you do? And I remember saying to Phyllis, look, let us produce this for you. We began what became to produce what was called Nothing Like a Dame.
Like a Dame.
But we did that specifically because the women in the community, the theater community, the Broadway community, had been so extraordinarily generous and a part of everything that we'd been doing leading up to that point, at a time when some folks would have told them, why are you bothering us with this? This isn't your issue, even though that was not the case.
Mhm.
But it was a way to sort of, why, well, this is just about gay men. I really felt that it was now our turn, as Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS, to stand with them. So that was the first time we really began. That was the beginning of our funding everything at the Actors Fund, everything that the Actors Fund does, by stepping forward with the Phyllis Newman Women's Health Initiative. And so that now, literally, the entire safety net of social services that the Actors Fund provides, down to right now, all this emergency assistance around COVID-19, we have always been very, very much a part of. So that when I go backstage, or somebody from Broadway Cares goes backstage to talk to folks about engaging in the appeals or signing posters or being a part of an event, we can truly say, this is you helping you.
Mm-hmm.
This is you making sure that should you ever need some sort of assistance around any issue, whatever that might be, insurance issues, addiction and recovery services, senior services, all sorts of things, that safety net will be there for you. And I think that's what's propelled us into this, the fact that we've been around now for, it merged actually now almost 30 years.
That's amazing. And the work that you're doing, though, is so far beyond the theater community.
Sure.
With the fires in Australia, I mean, you were there helping them out. This outreach of reaching beyond the theater community, a lot of people may not even be aware of that. So if you can talk a few
Well,
more.
I mean, sure. I mean, our mission now is as I explained to folks, our money goes essentially two directions. Half goes to the Actors Fund, which is the employee assistance program of the entertainment industry. So if you make your living in the industry, in the performing arts and entertainment industry, you qualify for assistance at the Actors Fund. And we now fund literally everything that they do. We've awarded the Actors Fund since 1988. I think it's like $120 million. Mm-hmm. It's literally, been $10 million since the shutdown a year ago in March around all of the support that they are providing in response to COVID, in addition to the other programs. The other way our money goes is through our national grants program to about 470 some social service agencies all across the country, food banks, housing programs, harm reduction programs, all health clinics, all sorts of things. Initially, that was all about a connection to HIV/AIDS. Now, many of those organizations, agencies, have also expanded their mission, and that we found out that actually expands their ability to fundraise to make sure that they can continue to take care of their initial clients, even as they reach out to take care of more. So what's happened is, for us within the community, is as the community responds to various crises or issues, we want to be able to be the way that they can do that without having to recreate yet another organization around one specific issue or crisis. So I really do keep my, ear to the ground, if you will, to see how we can respond for the community around what might be a natural disaster, or right now, racial and social injustice issues. Whatever marriage equality at one point. We've really become what I think, to a degree, the philanthropic heart of Broadway. The work that we do in raising money in ways that other communities don't have the access necessarily to do, that can be spread around to take care of ourselves, but also to reach out to many folks who are not necessarily part of our theatrical family.
Now, I want to ask you, pre-COVID, of course, what a typical day is like for you, or is there any such thing as a typical day in your life?
There's not really a typical day. I don't think. I mean, particularly not right now. I mean, I'm talking to you from my house that I bought a couple of years ago, upstate, outside of Hudson. So I've been working up here remotely since June. I live in Hell's Kitchen at 46th and 9th. But
have you been back?
I've been back for the day, maybe 7 or 8 times since June. Taking Amtrak back and forth to go into the office or deal with errands or to deal with things. But I've been up here since June, which is very odd. But everything has been turned on its head. But I have to say, we have been able to be resilient and responsible and flexible. I mean, literally everything we do with the shutdown nearly a year ago on March 12th flatlined every way that we usually...
March 12th and then Broadway Backwards, which I will say, and I love all the events that you guys do, but Broadway Backwards is my favorite night of the year in the theater. And I had my tickets, and it was supposed to be March 16th of last year.
Monday.
And yes, and then, and I remember getting the call from Leslie and Warren, and she was so nervous about coming to New York because of what they were hearing on the West Coast at that time. When were you first aware of hearing about COVID and, and how this was going to impact the theater?
I didn't necessarily know how it was going to impact the theater. I remember hearing about it or sort of getting inklings of it as people, in February, maybe. And then, again, as you do, I mean, sort of coming up with telling yourself what, how, I mean, no one had any idea. And certainly we weren't being encouraged to necessarily be smart about it. But I do remember hearing that, I guess it was the usher an usher at the Booth Theater.
Yes.
Was sick. And I remember thinking about that. We had just started the spring campaign leading up to what would have been last April's Easter bonnet competition. And I just remember thinking, oh my God, this everything's something. There's going to be this isn't just going to be business as usual. And I had also gone to the theater. I think the shutdown was on a Thursday. Mm-hmm. And I'd gone to see West Side Story on Tuesday evening, I think. And then I saw Girl from the North Country that Wednesday before. And I can remember just feeling like people were uneasy. And then every time someone coughed, there was, that it sort of, you could feel people sort of get tight, if you will. And so when the shutdown happened on the 12th, everything we do flatlined. And I knew that we just could not still do that event and take that kind of risk, that we needed to get ahead of this. So I think it was literally on Friday when we made the decision to cancel the event. The event could not happen. We didn't even know, the Aladdin wasn't going to be having performances. So how could we be there, on their stage? Mm-hmm. And then on Tuesday, that's where we instituted our first online campaign, which became the COVID-19 Assistance Fund, which since then is, in all variety of ways, has raised, over $8 million, $8.2 million. And
I want to point out, and I have on the bottom of the screen here, tonight is not a fundraiser. Tonight is just to celebrate Tom. But if any of you who are watching or listening are able to make a contribution, it's greatly appreciated. And any amount is appreciated. As you can see, the work is just going out way beyond our own community, and the outreach is just amazing. Tom, I'm going to ask you a question that you don't have the answer to. So it's all speculation. How do you see the theater coming back? Or do you even wrap your brain around it?
Oh, I think about it all the time. But I don't think anybody necessarily knows specifically. I mean, I'm sure there are all kinds of conversations being had in various places. Certainly the advent of the vaccine, the change in administration, thank God, so that can be responsibly, done and implemented is a huge move forward. Mm-hmm. I would imagine, that in terms of Broadway Cares, our offices have been closed, even though people are in and out a little bit, finance folks, and, we've had changes in staff, and, everything sort of has been reevaluated and redone in a way. People who were very busy had less to do. People who were doing sort of work that was steady but wasn't as busy as sort of producing these events suddenly were busier than they'd ever been. I would hope that when the community begins to come back to go into rehearsal and how that plays out in the summer, leading to what I hope would be feeling safe enough to step into some of these shows reopening, probably in a rollout as opposed to all at once, we will be able to step back in with that. But I do know that we will, will be a part of what people are comfortable and feel safe doing. It has turned everything on its head. And there's lots that we will only be able to address as we do it. Because it's going to require a lot of, there'll be, a lot of change and discomfort.
Now, of course, last year when everything shut down, we all were like stopped in our tracks. And here we are almost a year later, hard to believe. But since within the last year, how has Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS embraced where we are in terms of social media and all the work that you're doing? I know that there are a lot of fundraisers online and everything. And what are some of the things that you're finding that you're still resisting?
Resisting?
Yes.
I don't know about resisting. I mean, I think everybody's a little weary of sitting in front of a screen. I think we all long for when we can, sort of be jostling with each other in a room again, and working together in the heat of shared collaboration, as opposed to everything being done here sort of by yourself and then somehow being virtually stitched together. I have to say we have been very fortunate in what we've been able to do online with various fundraising campaigns, with opportunities that we would not even have imagined, such as an event called Quarantunes that we've been doing online, such as the fact that we were the beneficiary of NBC's Best of Broadway presentation that I think they did on, what was it, December 10th?
December 10th, yes.
And that we were able to have Nathan Lane and Vanessa Williams, Sean Hayes, and Billy Porter do those appeals for us. And that was a lot of work and work that we've never necessarily done before.
Attention, which is wonderful.
But it's what's kept our head above water so that we can continue to provide the support for the Actors Fund that has allowed them to reach out to a community that is truly challenged and suffering, in ways that are specifically about Broadway, and then in ways that sort of we all are experiencing. We've done dozens of virtual events. We've done look backs. We just last Thursday, I think it was, we did ABC Daytime back on Broadway.
Yes.
We had done those events at Town Hall from 2005 to 2011. ABC Daytime salutes Broadway Cares. So we literally did a compilation of the archival material and taped some new pitches and did some new things with Kelly Ripa and Susan Lucci and Cameron Matheson, and put together an evening for here that folks could watch at home and make a donation online. And we raised $130,000 from that. And that keeps folks engaged with us. But I think we long to get back into a room with each other.
Absolutely. And what's next for you?
For me? For me. You know what? I feel that my life is best led both professionally and personally by being responsive as opposed to reactive, if that makes sense. By doing often what's right in front of me with a sense of what might be a little bit behind that, but without projecting into an unknown that I just cannot really hope to navigate until I get there. I think that's what's kept Broadway Cares nimble, if you will, why we have been able to expand as we have, why we've been able to be responsive to COVID as we have, both for the community and for the hundreds of organizations that we work with, across the country. So, my next challenge, if you will, Broadway Cares' next challenge, is going to be how we step back with the entertainment industry, with the Broadway community, into live performance again.
Mm-hmm.
And where is our place in that? Knowing that those are going to be cautious steps. And having to navigate systems and feelings and issues that we have never had to address before.
Well, whatever it is, I'm there with you. Absolutely.
Thank you.
And Tom, thank you. I can't believe this, but we are at the end of our show. I hope it was fun for you. But thank you for taking the time
Thanks,
to be here
Richard.
tonight. I want to thank everyone who tuned in tonight. If you enjoyed the show, and I hope you did, please make a contribution to Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS. Also, please, if you're watching this on Facebook, go to my website, richardskipper.com, if you haven't done so already, and leave a testimonial in my guest book that helps to boost me in other markets. If you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment there, or this is on very many platforms, whatever podcast platform you listen to, leave a comment there and a rating. That helps in terms of moving us forward. I want to let everyone know that tomorrow afternoon at 2:00, I will be celebrating Lee Lassack. Do you know Lee?
I do.
And tomorrow is his birthday. So I hope he's not watching. I have a few surprises lined up for him. So we're going to celebrate him tomorrow afternoon. I also end every show by telling everyone to go out and do something nice for somebody else without expecting anything in return. Go to your Facebook friends list. The first name that pops up, pick up the phone and call that person. Let them know what they mean to you. Not a text, not an email, not a private message, a phone call. As my dear friend David Friedman says, we're all in this together, but we're not in the same boat. You don't know what anyone else is going through until you reach out for them. And Tom, I want to give you the final word. Anything that you want to expound upon that we talked about tonight that you want to build upon, anything that we didn't talk about that you wish that we had, or just any message that you want to put out to anyone who's watching or listening at this time. And again, thank you for all that you do.
I really just want to repeat something that Andre DeShields said recently. We did a virtual flea market in September, and there was a meet and greet that we auctioned online. And when we did that in a Zoom with Andre and the donor who had the winning bid, Andre said towards the end of the meeting, he said, generosity and gratitude are the fuel of the universe. And he's absolutely right. And it's the two of them together. It's being able not only to ask for help, but when you receive it, understanding how important it is to say thank you. And then to reach back and share the same with those in your circle.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom. Have a great night. Thank you.
All right, Richard. Thanks a lot. See you later.
You too.